this leads to something that's been, there are always, these things are really vague, you know, when you have your week and something just pops in vaguely. And I was hearing about a certain well-known talker or teacher or whatever, um, and and he was always an alcoholic, and I think he drank himself to death, you know, or whatever. That it certainly he didn't drop that habit, even though he was very well aware of, I believe, his true nature and this sort of thing. And there's other people that have, you know, that they still smoke and they have vices and all these things. And I was, and I heard a question somewhere. Someone was saying, why would they do that if they were self-realized? If you look a bit deeper, the body, you know, the body with all its habitual predispositions, perhaps even things it's learnt during the lifetime before it sort of sees what it is, develops, I suppose, uh, instincts or addictions or predispositions or likes, I suppose. And when the identification of a separate I isn't there to say, right, I have to knuckle down and, you know, I mean, I don't drink, but I used to, but you know, so I don't need to give up drinking. But if I say, I got to knuckle down and I've got to be disciplined and I've got to, every time I feel that desire, I'm going to override it and I'm not going to drink and I'm going to struggle with that and I'm going to force myself to not do this anymore, cigarettes or whatever drugs or alcohol, whatever it is, you know, or addictive relationships, you know, um, when that entity isn't there to force the organism story to change itself for the better in the story, there's no need for it to happen. It seems like for abiding balance, if you like, this is an interesting way to say it, abiding balance in functioning as a human being and just being as it is, part of the whole, but being, it feels like that gets interfered with, if you like, or disrupted or has turmoil placed in it by the background processes that are deeply subconscious and deeply rooted in instincts of the body and survival and all those other instincts that are out of reach of the conscious mind to actually control. So those things tend to keep the activity contracted in the mind as being a separate self. So when all these talks, all these discussions around the world that are happening are human beings helping that not take itself so seriously in the background as well. And if that can relax in the background as well, it seems to be rewritten. And then those contractive habit patterns of mind, of thinking, don't seem to reach up into the conscious mind and contract it and keep feeding the story and feeding the feeling of identification. And if that happens, there's just more space to be what it already is. And then it seems to open itself, you know, as I said, it was a couple of moments for me, but it was a particular letting go. But that can happen different ways for all. It might be a very gradual process for some. And then, you know, years later, they just look back and think, I don't even remember what that whole story was about, but I know it was a story now. That might happen as well. Just, you know, I did, you know, a couple of very intensive retreats as well as a lot of other stuff. And that sort of seemed to accelerate it here, but it wasn't accelerating to become what you already are. It was just perhaps acceleration of the release of the contracted mind, just never thinking it was anything but what it identified as. That just seemed to break, and it was in one moment. but the legacy of that's just continued, and but I think every human being will just be different the way that they navigate life. You know, just I do think that whole background process, nothing actually has to happen for you to be what you already are. But I do think there's something that happens in the subconscious, the background processing of the mind, that's already assumed that it is a separate self, that keeps feeding into that that contracted state. So it doesn't completely let go. And if it doesn't completely let go, it can't reintegrate with that knowing. And that's, that reintegration, I don't know how long it takes. I think it's still reintegrating here. I think it will probably for the rest of the life.
Yeah. That's what people say.
None of this is to really quantify what is really going on. It's just to say, just try to break down those processes that stop it being what it already is, that contract it from being what it already is. And also, it's not doing anything wrong by doing that. There's no minds that are doing things wrong by feeling contracted and separated, because it's this beautiful interplay. The universe knows if I just put it into a story, the universe knows what it's doing perfectly. And if it means that all these people have got contracted senses of self, it's probably, unfolding just as it should. The scientists these days are saying human beings actually don't perceive reality as it actually is. They perceive it in the most likely way for the organism to stay alive, to survive. And so it summarizes everything. And if human beings could understand the complexity of what's going on here, like absolutely quantifiably understand it all, it would just be, the mind wouldn't work. The mind would be overwhelmed. The brain would be overwhelmed, even with its complexity, unless it's in this sort of open state of not really needing to know. It's just in the flow. That's a different thing. That's sort of more my experience of John, is to more into that flow, but basically unknown, and then things just appear as they appear, and that's the complexity, and that's allowed to be because there's no forcing it away because I don't understand it. It's that learning to be, or sort of opening to be uncomfortable, to be comfortable with the unknown is, I think, a very strong, peaceful way to now progress through life. People that will speak about these sort of things and they say, well, I've got all these abilities now. The human imagination is so powerful. So the human mind can even make up beliefs and stories about how it accesses those things. And there's all sorts of degrees of, spiritual investigation, and there's absolute confidence in what they're saying. But it may well be, and I'd say there is an element of imagination and story making and fantasies in there, and they believe them, and they, the mind might have made them up through whatever experiences, or it may be a blend of accessing the field and adding the human mind brain story. Anytime it's explained, of course, it's put into a story through a human organism, filtered through that. So there's a couple of ideas of, maybe, or maybe a blend, or maybe fantasy. I don't know. As I said before, this does feel like one interconnected energetic change, intelligent energy at play and change. And it's always just now. It's always playing. It's always just expressing, changing, and interacting. And this human being tries to speak about some aspects of that, but it's complex, infinitely complex. And even that's probably just words.
Your experience of that decontraction being a single moment. I've watched a number of things where that has happened to people live on YouTube, where they're talking to somebody who is self-realized, and they're just doing that, the pointers in non-duality sort of thing. And they do what you described. They just do an immediate double take and just, of course, and that seems to be a very common experience of a very common experience of that decontraction happening, it being a moment, and almost everybody can pinpoint the hour, the day, the exact time that it actually happened.
Oh, I could tell you exactly where I was sitting on the side of a bed meditating at the time in a cabin on a retreat. I can tell you the texture of the bed sheets, the angle of the bed, everything. But as I said, that's only, that was only the mind understanding that could do that.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's not, I'd call it
Nothing. Yes,
a glimpse, a very powerful glimpse of awakening, but I don't think it's, I think the whole integration of awakening is, you know, I did have, at the same time, I sort of comprehended how some other well-known characters, it just was understood straight away that why they didn't go back, because they'd been in too much suffering to start with. So they just didn't allow the mind to contract back, because going back would have caused the organism more suffering than going back to the security of feeling like a separate self. So that's what I mean. Every human being and their background and their life experiences will be interplaying in what happens when, if this happens, and if it happens in different ways, whether it's gradual, whether it's, you know, does it need to happen in secure, you know, with a bit more security over years, who knows? So that's kind of a glimpse. But it's so beautiful when people just see what they are. You know, the human expression, as I keep saying, the human. I think some people don't like touching this message because they think, because the background process just goes, the separate self, the ego, the established entity starts to feel uncomfortable when this is getting too close. The moth's getting too close to the flame, and it's drawn to the flame, but it's, you know, it thinks it's going to burn its wings off, but you won't really burn your wings off. You might, you know, as I always say, just remember the other thing. As I always say, you know, there's no need to be unkind in the process, in the experience of the organism. There's no need to be forcing anything to happen. So it's just gaining that confidence to have, you know, to reinforce the fact that if they go a bit closer and they feel destabilized or insecure, or it won't feel comfortable. It certainly didn't here when it was it was like, I'm going anyway. I remember the words, I'm going anyway. And it was like that. But you don't want to touch it. You don't want to go there at all. But in the environment of a very deep meditation retreat, it was like, it predisposed that to be a bit easier than if I had to rush off and go to the shops or go to work or whatever. It probably wouldn't have created the space for that to push through. And that's push through is almost a word of force, and it's not forceful, but that's getting back to that first idea of that separate self entity can be a tool that is useful to transcend what it is holding itself back from. So that conscious intention can actually be can be used as a tool to say, well, the background process is saying no, but the foreground knowledge, even though all of that feels bad, is going to say go. And go look is one of those other things that I'll talk about. The need to find an answer in self-inquiry, even the who am I question. I do remember doing that, that investigation for quite a while, and having all sorts of mind plays that went on until, I don't know, things just changed. I can't remember exactly what happened. It's like recalling an old story, but it was more, there wasn't an answer that was needed. It was just unknowingness. It was just openness. So that wasn't really an answer. Certainly wasn't a satisfactory answer for the thinking mind. It was when that thinking mind was okay with not knowing anything that it actually became, who am I? What it is. So it's a very counterintuitive. The whole thing's so counterintuitive. Just notice it, because you don't need to do anything with it. There's just no judgment or resistance, and that's a pretty good start. That's a pretty good, place to stay in this openness. Just see what happens, and accept it as it is. That's the whole, as it is. It's already as it is. It's already going to play out as it will. You won't understand why unless you try to think you can control that idea. And once again, just seeing that is enough for it to go, this will be navigated, but it knows how to navigate it more, more in flow, if I'm not strangling it the whole time with separation. You know, if I'm not cutting off a greater intelligence of flow. That's really what it, and that's really count. I'm still playing with this as John, as the old background processing is opening all the time and deepening all the time. But it's that noticing that sometimes the trust in the open flow, the doing mind tries to lean a bit into that more than it should. That still happens, I think. But it's seen. So even that's okay. And it keeps seeming to change. That level of these things seems to change. I have no idea how much. That doesn't matter. Just notice that this organism still does these things. It's okay. It's not what you would call in an idea perfect, you know, awake person doing things a certain way, but it's okay. And that feels deeply enriched and open and loving. You know, that feels even more of a reminder to love this. And that love is just recognition, self-recognition in the idea of the whole, recognizing its play. That's all.